everybody, it's Courtney. Today I am going to be using the Calm and Bright stamp set by Miss Ink Stamps to create a one-layer scene. And we're going to be creating our scene both with ink blending and our Copic markers. So I have a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I'm kind of just arranging my stamps to get an idea of the positioning. I want to minimize the amount of masking I'm doing here, just because the trees would be a little bit difficult to cut out. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp out my animals first. I'm putting my deer in the back because the size of the stamp is roughly the same size as the other, and clearly a deer is a lot bigger than a fox or a mouse. So I'm going to put him back a little bit further because he would obviously appear smaller the further back he gets. Going to go ahead and mask out the fox as well as this bunny and mouse here. And I didn't bother to cut the mask that well. I just masked out the area that actually needed to be masked out. I'm going to stamp this larger tree right behind these animals, and I'm going to do the same thing for the deer as well. I just masked out just the portion I needed to be masked out, and I'm stamping the smaller tree because, again, that would be a little bit further back. I am stamping with Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink. And once my stamping was done, we are going to go ahead and create our background. And again, I didn't want to mask out the individual images, so I'm going to create my sky above all of my images. I am taking a piece of Inkadinkado masking paper, and all I'm doing is cutting a wavy line. And this will be the background, or masking out the background anyway, and it will be the hills of snow. So I'm going to take this piece and mask out the bottom portion of my card panel, and we are going to do a little bit of ink blending for the sky. I'm going to be using 4 different colors of Distress Oxides for this. I'm using Picked Raspberry, Seedless Preserves, Dusty Concord, and Blueprint Sketch. Going to be using a blending buddy brush here, and I'm just going to start off by laying out my 4 colors. I'm not getting them to blend right away. I'm just laying them down. Starting off with the Picked Raspberry, then moving on to the Seedless Preserves, then the Dusty Concord, and the Blueprint Sketch right on the top. I am just wiping off my blending brush each and every time. I am using 2 separate ones, one for the purple and blue and one for the pink and Seedless Preserves, which is kind of like a magenta color. And I'm just wiping them off in between. You do not need a separate brush for every color that you own. As long as you kind of stick with the same color family and wipe it off in between, either on a cloth or a scrap piece of paper, you should be fine. So once I reach the top, I'm going to go back in the opposite direction and just get these colors to blend a little bit better. And keep in mind the Distress Oxides lay on top of the paper for a while before they kind of soak in. So you have time to go back and blend them out even without adding additional ink. So once my ink blending was done, I wanted to add a little bit of snow in the background. So I am taking some white gouache, and this is by Arteza. And I'm going to water this down just a little bit, but instead of using the plain water that I typically use, I'm using this pixie dust from Ink on 3, and I'm just placing like 2 drops on there to kind of water that down and thin that out, but it will also add a little bit of shimmer. So I'm just going to take my paintbrush, mix that together, and spatter that onto my night sky there. I did let this dry for about 10 minutes or so before moving on to my coloring. It's not a necessity, being I'm not doing any coloring over my ink blending, but I just don't trust myself and I tend to leave fingerprints. So I did let this dry for a couple of minutes. So next we're going to create our background on the bottom portion where our snow is. And I'm going to do this with my Copic markers. So I'm going to bring out the V25, which is the darkest color I'm using for the snow. And I'm going to create a shadow under each one of my animals. And I'm just kind of going along with the shape of them, not really being too concerned about it being perfect because we're going to blend this out. But I just want to make sure that I have a good amount of a shadow underneath each one. Next, I'm going to bring out the V22, and I'm just going to extend these shadows out a little bit further. I'm going to extend them down, and I'm going to extend them off to the side. Next, I'm going to bring in the R20 and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to extend it a little bit more off to each side as well as down, I guess, below the animals. I wanted to add a little bit of texture to the snow, so I'm just going to kind of randomly add some wavy lines, and this will kind of give the snow some texture, maybe some hills in the background. And I'm not going to do this with my darkest color. I'm only going to do this with my midtone and my lightest color, and I'm just going to blend that out a little bit. Next, I'm going to bring in my colorless blender, and I'm going to go over the areas very quickly where the V20 meets the white paper, just so that it's a little bit more of a seamless blend. And I'm also going over those little hills to kind of tone those down a little bit. You can add as many or as little as you want. I kind of went back and forth, added a few more here and there and kind of extended them out a little bit. And as long as that colorless blender that we added is still a little bit wet, or the paper is still a little bit wet, you can add even more color and it will kind of just blend with that colorless blender to kind of give a more toned down look. So for the snow on the trees, I'm going to use the same combination. I'm going to add just a little tiny bit of that V25, and I'm just adding this to random areas. There's really no rhyme or reason for where I'm placing my shading. I just wanted to have a variation in color on the snow. So I'm going to bring out that V22 and I'm going to extend those areas out, and I may or may not add some extra shadows to some of these snow areas. Not every dark area needs to be with the darkest color, so just keep in mind that you can always use your midtones to add additional shadows. They just won't be quite as dark. So I'm going to bring back in that V20 and I'm going to extend these areas out, and you can see that I am still leaving some white space. And then I'm going to bring in that colorless blender again, just to kind of tone down and make it more of a seamless blend for each one of these little areas of snow on the trees. So it looks a little crazy now. It looks really crazy now, but once everything is colored, it will kind of all make sense. So we're going to start off with the trees, and I'm going to go with each one of these little branches or pine cones, or I guess they'd be branches. I don't know, but I'm going to use 3 different greens. I'm going to start right with my darkest color here, and I'm just adding a little flick on the base of each one of these little branches or leaves or whatever you want to call them with that G99. Then I'm going to bring in the G94, and I'm just going to extend that flick out just a little bit further. I'm not over blending here. I'm kind of going over the areas pretty quick because I don't want to over blend. I want a variation in color here. Then I'm going to bring in the G43, which is the lightest color, and I'm just going to fill in the rest of these little branches. Again, being careful not to go over the same area more than once. I'm pretty much filling it in and moving on to the next one. Otherwise, if you go over it too many times, you're going to over blend and it's just going to be one color because it's such a teeny tiny area. So next we're going to move on to the actual branches and the tree trunk itself. And I'm going to bring in some E50 markers here. And again, I'm going to go right in with my darkest color because there's not a whole lot of area to work with here. So for the tree trunk, this is obviously a round object, so I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to either side with that E59, and I'm also bringing this down a little bit on the branches. So where the branches meet the trunk of the tree, I'm adding a little bit of shading there as well with that E59. Next, I'm going to bring in the E57, and I'm just going to extend these areas out a little bit further, but making sure that I'm keeping a center highlight for the actual trunk of the tree. And I'm extending the shadows out from the branches as well. So where we added that E59, where the branch meets the trunk of the tree, I'm just going to extend it out just a teeny tiny bit more. Finally, I'm going to bring in the E55, and this will be the highlight color. I'm just going to add this to the center portion of the tree trunk and more, I guess, the edges or the tips of the branches themselves. I went ahead and colored the other tree the same way, the snow, branches, and leaves, all the same exact way with the same color combination. And then we're going to move on to the animals. So I'm going to start off with the deer. I like to start with my lightest color first. Not only does this saturate the paper and make my blending a little bit easier, but it also maps out my darkest areas so that if I make a mistake, it's a lot easier to cover up that lightest color than it is the darkest color. Once I'm happy with where I'm placing the shadows, I will go in with my darkest color, pretty much just go over those same areas. For this deer, there are going to be some shadows where his face is hanging over his body, where his legs are bent, also where his hind leg there would cast a shadow on the rest of his body. And also the little baby deer in front of him would also cast a shadow on him. So I'm adding a little bit of shading there, and also the texture to his face. So where I guess his nose is, or his snout, or whatever you want to call it, that would be cast a shadow as well. So going to blend that darkest color out a little bit with that E33, which is the darkest midtone. Then moving on to the E31, which is going to be the lightest midtone. And I'm still keeping a highlight area for the E30. No matter how small it is, you do want to make sure that you're maintaining some sort of highlight area, even in the smallest spaces. And that is what's really going to give you that contrast, not just the scary dark, but also that scary light color. So going to finish off with that E30 for that highlight color, and I'm going to use the same color combination for this baby deer as well. I'm just going to use that E37, which is that scary dark color, a little bit more sparingly. So I'm going to add a little bit less of that to that baby deer, but I am using that in the very darkest areas. So pretty much only where those shadows would be. But blending that out again with that E33, E31, and then finishing off with that E30. Now, I wanted to add a little bit of texture because honestly, it just looked like one big blob to me, being they are the same color. So I ended up taking, once my coloring was done of this baby deer, I ended up taking my colorless blender and I just added a few little dots to his back, or I guess maybe his side, just to add a little bit of texture to his fur. It's hard to see on camera, but it is a little bit noticeable when you see it in person. And this just adds a little bit of texture and you can kind of differentiate between the two deer. For the adult male deer here, buck, I think you call it. I'm just going to fill in his nose with that E37 solid color here and a C7 for his eyes, and bringing then it back in that E30 for his antlers. Then I'm just going to color those in solid. I'm not worried about doing any shading for those. Next, we're going to move on to the next little group of animals here, and I'm going to start off with the fox. Again, starting off with this lightest color to map out my darkest areas. My shadows are going to be very similar to the ones for the deer, as far as where their legs are bent and things like that. But the fox looks as if he has a pretty fluffy tail. So I'm adding some flick lines, some pretty long flick lines for his tail, just to kind of maintain that texture that his tail would naturally have. And you can see that I'm going in the direction of the tail, or the shape of the tail, I should say. So my flicks towards the bottom and the top portion of his tail are going to be a little bit more rounded, and the ones that are in the center are going to be a little bit more straight. Now you want to make sure that when you're adding texture with your flick lines are different lengths. So you don't want them to all be the same, or you're just going to get regular old coloring. So you want to make sure that you're varying the lengths of your flicks, and this is what will give you the texture. And also being careful not to over blend. The more we go over it with the lighter colors, the more you're going to get it to blend, and the more you're going to actually lose that texture. So I'm finishing off with the Y23, and I wasn't liking the way his back was looking. So I ended up going back in with that lightest midtone and adding a little bit more of that, and then quickly blending that out with that Y23 again. And I liked the contrast a lot better. Now for the white areas, I'm going to bring in some C markers because any white object still has some shading to it. And I'm going to add my shadows the same places I have been adding them. It's just with a different color combination. I am going to leave some white space, but just keep in mind that especially being it's nighttime here, or just about nighttime, it is definitely going to have some shadows. Now I'm going to use the same C markers for this little mouse as well, but I'm going to skip the lightest one because I obviously want him to look gray and not white. But there's not a whole lot of area to work with here, so you may only be able to fit 2 or 3 colors in for a small image like this, and that's fine. Just make sure that they're far enough away from each other on the spectrum where you're still going to get the contrast. Even if you use 2 different colors, try to use like a C4 and a C1 or something like that so that you can still get that contrast you're looking for. Finally, we are going to move on to this little bunny, and I'm going to bring in some R20 markers, and I am going to again start off with that lightest color to get those areas mapped out and to get the paper saturated. And my scary dark color here is the E29, which is super dark. It's a very dark brown. So I'm using it very sparingly. I'm only putting this in the very, very darkest areas, and I'm using the tip of my marker. You'll see that my marker is pretty much straight up and down, and that is how you're going to be able to get into those tiny areas. Going to blend that out with the E25, then the E23, and then I'll move back to that E21 for that highlight color. Now his ears are a little bit floppy, but I still wanted to add a little bit of color to the inside of his ears, same way as I did with the mouse. So once all of my coloring was done, and you'll notice that I did color in the entire ear with that E21, which is the latest color, and this will just tone down the pink. I'm going to use an R20 for the pink area for the inside of his ears, but by going over the area with your lightest color, or in this case a brown, it's going to just tone down that pink, so it's not going to be too vibrant. I did add just a tiny bit of shading to his little tail as well. So next, moving on to the owl, and get ready because there's a disaster that's about to happen. I'm going to go right in with the darkest color for his wings, which is an E99. And then I am going to attempt to blend this out with a marker that I've never used before. And there we have a big blob. So I took off the other cap to kind of even out the pressure. And then I realized it left a whole puddle on my work surface. I have been using Copics for over 2 years now, and I've never in my life had this happen to me. This is a brand new marker. In fact, I got it with that Hobby Lobby discount or sale that was going on a couple of weeks ago, and I'm not sure what happened. So this is going to take a lot of cleaning. I'm not sure if I'm ever going to be able to use this marker, but notice that I have a big blob on my card. Luckily, it's a pretty light color. I'm going to go in with my colorless blender just to kind of fade that down. And before I continue to try to get that up or remove it completely, I'm going to let that colorless blender dry. Not only did we have a whole lot of ink from the marker blobbing, but now we've added a colorless blender on top of it. So I'm going to continue on with the regular coloring. Once that area is dry, I'm going to go back in with my colorless blender and try to remove that color a little bit more. And luckily, it was a light color, and I was able to completely remove it and get rid of it, and nobody will ever know that it's there. And if they do, it's a handmade card. No handmade card is perfect. So I hate when people say that they can't post something or they can't send something or they can't share something because it's not perfect. There's no such thing. If you want perfect, go buy Hallmark, and guaranteed you're still not going to be perfect. So don't beat yourself up over imperfections in your card. That's what makes it handmade. So I'm going to finish off with the sentiment with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink right there on my night sky. And then I'm just going to add some shimmer to my snow on the trees, and then just kind of random areas throughout my little snowy hills. And so when you twist and turn the card, it will give a little shimmer in random places. But that is it. That is the card for today, guys. I will leave all of the supplies listed in the description box below. Thank you so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.